Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk a bit of an adventure story, reading from a book that is essentially the Chronicle of Ramon Montaner, a Catalan author of the 14th century, the 13th and 14th century, that is mostly famous for his own work, but also because he was also a mercenary captain of the famous Almogávares, I believe it's the name in Spanish. The very famous Catalan company that practically was made up by Catalans, Aragonese, Sicilians, that after the peace of Caltabellotta between the Angevins and the Aragonese in 1282 in southern Italy went into the east, into today's Turkey and Greece, and making really a lot of mess. If you know the story, you know what I'm talking about. And it's an extraordinary work. I never had the pleasure to read it all, but I've read certain passages of it in translation also, and this is what we're gonna do today. This is a bit of a reading chapter, and I will be assisting myself with an English translation that I found on the internet. I will leave you the link to it below. Which is the Chronicle of Ramon Montaner, translated by Lady Goodenough, which sounds pretty nice, and that we will be reading in the chapter number 100 and no, excuse me, 194, if I count correctly. And the page in this version starts from 389 page, but I would like to give a bit of a background. Why do I want to read a passage of this story? Well, because I would like to stress a bit how adventurous it was sometimes, and how entrepreneurial also in many ways. The creation of mercenary companies during the end of the 13th and especially the first half of the 14th century. The Catalan company was actually one of the first big companies that went roaming into the Mediterranean. There weren't many as such. The most famous companies were actually in northern and central Italy, or during the 100 Years' Wars, the general, the Catalans in this had been a kind of way openers in many ways, but they also hit in certain regions of the Mediterranean that in that specific moment were weaker. And this is what these mercenaries really did, because when there is a strong authority, you don't go bothering it so much. Maybe you can sell your services to it, but it's not surprising that the 14th century, being a century of crisis, actually saw the rise of such mercenary companies. But here the story wants to be concentrated especially on the figure of Roger de Flor, Rutger von Blum in German, or Ruggero da Fiore in Italian, who was for several years he was actually the creator of the Catalan company, and we will be the organizational process in here of how he managed to rise to power and to come at the head of the Almogávares at this point. The Catalan mercenaries were actually pre-existing here, and they were being used especially by the Angevins. They were freely selling their services into the Mediterranean, and they start to become important because Aragon is a bit of the kingdom of Aragon was a bit on the rise in this moment, especially Catalonia was expanding with Barcelona as a port, so the access to the Mediterranean was opened at this point. And in fact, we will be reading in a context that is essentially the southern Italian one, during the wars between the Aragonese that had conquered Sicily and the Angevins that remained in Naples. So it was a lot of especially naval warfare, because between across the 13th and 14th century there is a huge quantity of resources invested in West into naval warfare, especially in the Mediterranean, but also in the North Seas. Which actually tells you how important and remunerative maritime businesses were growing at this point. And in fact, we will be seeing, and this is what I cared most about, how a war and this military company was created by being fed by trade and by piracy, telling the truth, because at this point, that's basically the same thing. Pirates raid to sell somewhere else, so it's kind of whole picking and of taking here and giving there, in a very non-dramatic description, I'd say. And the figure of Roger of Flor, de Flor was amazing. He was half German and half Italian, but we will be reading here in the passage. He was born and raised in southern Italy, and he quickly rose to power as firstly, as telling the truth, he was a Templar. He was a Templar knight. Then eventually he was expelled by the order, and he became a mercenary at this point. He was very skilled in maritime warfare. Then eventually he had quite an adventurous life. I will surely talk about Roger of Flor in a dedicated video. He became a Mega Ducas of the Byzantine Empire. He managed to Porphyrogenitus princess, that is son of a Byzantine emperor, and he was finally killed by the same. He basically carved his own princedom into the east. And he was killed eventually by order of the Basileus Michael IX, and eventually avenged by his soldiers. And the work of Ramon Montanera is amazing because it tells the whole story. Also because Ramon participated to the company between 1302 and 1307, so he kind of lived into this, and it's a beautiful witness of that part of history. And then the Catalan company lived on into the after the death of Roger. There is the famous Battle of Cephissus in Frankish Greece that makes one of the best examples of the progress of infantry tactics at the beginning of the 14th century. But here we want to read, in fact, this passage finally. Sorry for the long premise, but I will be reading it, and without spoiling anything, we will comment what I think is interesting. Then you will tell me your opinion about this passage. So here it began, and I thank very much Madam Good Enough, so that makes proper crediting. So I began. Recounts the beginnings of Fray Roger, who was afterwards so exalted, and of the great deeds of prowess he performed in his life. It is the truth that the Emperor Frederick, I'm talking here it's talking about Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, had a falconer who was from Germany and was called Roger de Flor, which in Germany was really Blume, like what it means flower in the German tongue. And he was a very gallant man, and he gave him to wife at Brindisi a damsel, daughter of an honorable man of the city of Brindisi, who was a wealthy man. Between what the emperor gave him and what he had with his wife, he became a very rich man, and by her he had two sons. The eldest was called Jacopo de Flor, and the younger was called Roger de Flor. And at that time Conradin came to the kingdom of Sicily. The elder of these was not more than 4 years old, and Roger not more than 1. And their father was a man expert in arms, and wished to fight in the battle of Conradin against King Charles, and in that battle he was killed. King Charles, when he had seized the kingdom, took for himself everything belonging to all who had been in battle, and what had belonged to the family of the emperor or King Manfred. There remained no more to those boys than what their mother had brought as her marriage portion, for of the rest they were disinherited. And at that time the ships of commercial houses touched at Brindisi, and those of Apulia, who wished to take pilgrims and provisions from the kingdom, came here to spend the winter. The commercial houses all had, and have still, great establishment at Brindisi and in Apulia, and in all the kingdom. And so the ships which winter there begin to load up in the springs to go to Acre, and take pilgrims and oil and wine and all kinds of grain and of wheat. And assuredly it is the best fitted out place for the passage beyond sea of any belonging to Christians, and in the most abundant and fertile land, and it is very near Rome. And it has the best harbour of the world, so that there are houses right down to the sea. And later on, when the boy Roger was about 8, it happened that a notable of the Templars, a brother sergeant, called Fray Vassaille, who was a native of Marseille, and was commander of a ship of the Templars, and was a good seaman, came with his ship to spend a winter at Brindisi, and he took in ballast, and had the ship repaired in Apulia. And whilst he was having the ship repaired, the boy Roger ran about the ship and the rigging as lightly as if he were a monkey, and all day he was with the sailors, because the house of his mother was near to where the ship was taking in ballast. And the notable Fray Vassaille took a liking to the boy Roger. He loved him as he were his son, and he asked his mother for him, and said that if she gave him up to him, he would do all in his power to get him a good post with the Templars. And the mother, as he seemed to her a man of importance, gave the boy up to him willingly, and he received him. And the boy turned out the most expert boy at sea. He performed marvels of climbing and of all things. When he was 15, he was considered one of the best mariners of the world, and when he was 20, he was an accomplished mariner in theory and in practice, so that the worthy Fray Vassaille let him do entirely as he liked with the ship. And the master of the Templars, seeing him so zealous and expert, gave him the mantle and made him brother sergeant, and a short time after he had been made a brother. The Templars bought a great ship from the Genoese, the greatest that had been built at that time, and it was called the Falcon, and they gave it to this Fray Roger de Flor. And in this ship he sailed a long time, showing great knowledge and great valor. He found himself at Acre in this ship, and the Templars did so well with this ship that they liked none so well as this one. This Fray Roger was the most generous man ever born. He can only be compared to the young king. And all he gained he divided and gave to the principal Templars, and to many friends he knew how to make. And at that time Acre was lost, and he was in the harbour of Acre with his ship, and brought away ladies and damsels and great treasure and many important people. And then likewise he brought the people to Mont Pellegrin, so that he made infinite gain on that journey. And when he returned, he gave much to the master, and to those who were powerful amongst the Templars. And when this was done, envious people accused him to the master, saying that he had a great treasure which had remained to him of the affair at Acre. The master seized all that he found of his, and then wanted to seize him. But he heard of this, left the ship in the harbor of Marseille, and went to Genoa, where he found Miser Ticino Doria and other friends he had known how to make. And he borrowed so much from them that he bought a good galley called Oliveta, and fitted it out very well. And he came to the Duke of Catania with the galley, and offered himself to him to support him with the galley and in person. But the Duke did not receive him well, neither in deeds nor in words, and so he remained 3 days without being able to get a favourable answer. And on the 4th day he appeared before him and said, Lord, I see it does not please you that I should be in your service. Wherefore I commend you to God, and shall go and seek another lord, to whom my service will be pleasing. And the Duke answered that he might go, and good luck go with him. And he embarked at once and came to Messina, where he found the Lord King Frederick. Here it's written Frederick, but yeah, it sounds more or less the same. And he appeared before him, and offered himself to him, and sat down to the Duke. And the Lord King received him very graciously, and thanked him for his offer. And at once he made him a member of his household, and assigned him good and honourable provision. And he and all who had come with him did homage to the king. Fray Roger, when he saw the fine and honourable reception the Lord King gave him, was very content, and when he had remained 8 days with the Lord King, and had refreshed his followers, he took leave of the Lord King, and set his course for Apulia. And he took a ship of King Charles loaded with victuals, which was going to the Duke to Catania. And at once he manned it with some of his company, and those of the ship he put in galley, and sent the ship, which was 3-decked, and loaded with grain and other provision, to Syracuse. And afterwards he took full 10 Terids, that are some ships, likewise loaded with provisions, which King Charles was sending to the Duke. And with these Terids, or Terids, I really don't know how it is, he came to Syracuse, where there was a great lack of provisions. And with the galley he likewise put some provisions into the castle of Augusta. What shall I tell you? With that price he provisioned Syracuse and the castle of Augusta and Lentini, and all the other places holding out for the Lord King around Syracuse. And he arranged to sell the victuals in a great market at Syracuse, and sent some to Messina. And with the money he paid the soldiers who were in the castle of Syracuse, and in the city at Augusta and at Lentini, and all the other places. He paid every one for 6 months, some in coin, some in victuals. And so he revived everything. And when he had done this, he had still left of the grain he had made, full 8,000 ounces. And when he came to Messina, and sent to the Lord King, who was going about Sicily, 1,000 ounces in fine carlinos, and paid also for 6 months the soldiers who were with Count de Squillace, and at Calana and La Mota, and the castle of Sant'Agata, and at Pentedatilo, and Amandolea, and Gerace, namely in money and in victuals. And then he equipped at once, besides his own, 4 galleys which he took from the dockyard. And when he had equipped them, he at once set his course again for Apulia, and took at Otranto the ship of N. Berenguer Samuntada of Barcelona, which was loaded with wheat belonging to King Charles, a great 3-decked ship which King Charles was sending to Catania. And he manned it and sent it to Messina, and he gave a great largesse to the city from the other ships, and Lenis he took. He sent over 30 there, likewise loaded with provisions, so that his gain was infinite, and the good he did to Messina and Reggio and all the district was immense. And when he had done all this, he bought full 50 mounts, and all of good quality, and mounted Catalan and Aragonese squires, which he received in his company. And he took 5 Catalan and Aragonese knights into his house, and with a great quantity of money he went to where the Lord King was, and found him at Piazza. And there he gave him more than 1,000 ounces in coin, and more than to any others he gave to Don Blasco and Galceran and Berenguer de Entenza, for whom he conceived so much love that they lived like brothers, and agreed that all things should be in common between them. What shall I tell you? There was no rich home or knight who did not accept his presence, and in all the castles to which he came he paid the soldiers for 6 months. So did he strengthen the Lord King and refresh his followers, that one of them was worth as much as 2 had been before. And the Lord King, saying his words, made him a vice-admiral of Sicily and a member of his council, and gave him the castles of Trippi and Alicata and the revenues of Malta. And Fray Roger, seeing the honour bestowed on him by the Lord King, left his company of horse with him, and left as their chiefs 2 knights, one called Anne Berenguer de Montroig, a Catalan, and the other Miser Roger de la Matina. And he left money with them for their keep and for what they would need. And he took leave of the Lord King, and came to Messina, and equipped 5 galleys and a lany, and proceeded to scour all the principality and the Roman shore, and the strand of Pisa and Genoa, and of Provence and Catalonia and Spain and Barbary. And all he found belonging to friend or foe, in coin or valuable goods, which he could put on board the galleys, he took. And to friends he wrote out a note of his debt, and told them that when peace was made he would pay them. And from enemies he took all of value he found, but left them their lanies and their lives, for he injured nobody's person. And so everyone parted from him satisfied, and he made endless gain in that journey, in gold and silver and valuable goods, as much as the galleys could carry. And so, with this gain, he returned to Sicily, where all the soldiers, horse and foot, were awaiting him as the Jews do the Messiah. And when he came to Trapani, he heard that the Duke had marched against Messina, and was besieging it by sea and land. But Fray Roger went to Syracuse, and there dismantled his galleys. And wherever the soldiers were awaiting him, full of confidence, he proceeded to succour them, for to every man, horse or foot, he found guarding a castle in Sicily and in Calabria. He gave pay for further 6 months, so that all the soldiers were so full of good will that one was worth as much as 2. And then he sent at once for his company, likewise paid it, and sent the Lord King and all the rich homans great refreshment of money. Okay, so aside my bad pronunciation, we are done. So, I think there is a number of interesting details in this rather long passage. It's a chapter basically, and I want to discuss them a bit in general. First of all, it's a beautiful source, as you understand. It's a very chivalric. Ramon Montaner was obviously writing something that aimed at, aggrandizing the figure of Roger de Flor. We don't know whether he was really so gallant when he went to spoiling the the other people's ships or docks, etc., or if he never killed anyone. I think, considering the outrage of those times, especially all the warfare going on into the Mediterranean at that time, it's not really credible. And although I'm not expert in this source specifically, it's pretty evident that the author is sticking to certain chivalric models, which is still meaningful, however, to conceive even objectively, the affairs that happened in those times, in the sense that I know fairly well certain contemporary sources to Ramon of Montaner, even if, well, not so distant from here, telling the truth. And even in very objective sources, what you find, especially when talking about warfare, etc., is that in spite of all the crude details, the interests, etc., it was still an ideal picture of the knight, of the man of valor that is also gallant. That he, here it says, even he saved all the pool cells and girls from Acre, that, by the way, at this time was the last Christian avampost of Outremer. So eventually it fell, as it's said also in here, if I'm not wrong. Telling the truth, it was a very difficult environment we're talking about, but still the idea of gallantry was praised, and prized too, because I believe that here the prize was objectively dealing with the with whole piracy business with a touch of gallantry. Even in other parts of literature, you find the idea that the pirate is a kind of romantic figure. Aside from the strictly setting that can make you romantic, like the sea and all, the solitary figure, but it's really also about how these people dealt with people's lives. For instance, here it says that Roger was praised because he spared people's lives, and that these people would be even happy not to have been slaughtered, of course, even though I don't think they would be so happy about them being robbed. Another interesting detail relatively to that is that he's explicitly said to have robbed his own friends as well, because he was sent by the king to perform these raids, and he met invariably a lot of people who had been friends to him before. And this really happens all the time. I mean, the political situation was so complicated that there were constantly factions changes, variations in politics, etc. Here, Roger was really from the side of the Ghibellines, because he, as you understand here, he was born in southern Italy into the Angevin kingdom, but his family had been had its good confiscated because his German father, who had been faithful to the Hohenstaufen, had decided to take arms against Charles of Anjou to fight in the famous battle of Tagliacozzo against Conradin of Sweden, who had come back to Italy to claim his inheritance. The Angevins here are the kind of the villains, and overall the whole wealth block, because here southern Italy was being ruled by the Angevins, who were the pupils of the Pope, and they were basically the same thing with the Kingdom of France, because they were French and fighting for the same against the Empire and against the Ghibellines in northern Italy. And Aragon instead fought, in fact, alongside the Ghibellines against the Angevins. So he decides basically to go search fortune into Sicily. Among the Aragonese, he first tried with the Duke of Catania, and this is also interesting, that there is no really centralized state or a singular political entity with which to dialogue. Here the Duke of Catania was supposedly, part of the vice royaume of Sicily that was in the hands of the Aragonese. But as you see, the local nobility was pretty sneaky. You know, there were, by the way, many attempts at this time from the Angevins to recover Sicily with a lot of military expeditions, especially at Messina. So even the allegiance of the Sicilian barons and dukes, or whatever you want to call them, to the Aragonese crown was really floating. So you can understand, as I was saying before reading, that it's exactly within this instability and fragmentation that pirates can expand and dwell. And this has happened historically at every time. You know, piracy came back when the Roman Empire fell, when the Carolingian Empire fell, when where there was any form of weakness of big blocks that up to that time had instead granted a certain stability. So Roger actually becomes he becomes rich thanks to not to military deeds, because you see that here in the it's even surprising when you read it that this was a great general eventually, and even commander, military man, but he rises basically as a mariner, as a sailor. So there is really no military connotation to that, but at a certain point you notice that he makes a lot of money just to eventually have his own military retinue. So what the sources is suggesting is that there was a quite evident objective this time to make money, to have your own armed retinue, and to become a mercenary, and to go seize a lot of even kingdoms and empires, like the Catalans actually did in the East, for yourself. And it is quite interesting that the whole business is done through feeding the population, like importing grain in these big southern Italian coastal cities with ports and all, and making a lot of money into the area. Now this is interesting also because southern Italy at this point was facing a quite steady economical crisis, because with the splitting of mainland southern Italy and Sicily from the original entire kingdom, both Sicily and Naples had seen an economical crisis, a political fragmentation, a general decline. It was a system crumbling, and the cities here were evidently suffering of not just of that, but also of the continuous wars that the Angevins and the Aragonese were doing, in spite of the truces and all, which really meant a little. So it's obvious that piracy was carried out with certain military skill, because it's still naval warfare that is needed here. But here, maybe the source, obviously, it's conceiving it. What the source stresses is that aside piracy, Roger made a fortune through trade. Right? It was by selling these goods, and what is also very beautiful is that he was meant in quite a chivalric fashion to have been capable of paying everyone for a long time, which is really, considering that the author here was a mercenary, well, it was quite of an issue. And it really meant a lot, because during this time the mercenaries are really expanding, increasing all over Europe in politics and military, and the pay was a very good indicator of even the success of a military leader. So the fact that Roger could send all this money, and at the end of the chapter here, you even find that his soldiers were awaiting him as the Jews do with the Messiah. So you can understand here the faith that the soldiers had in him, there is something that romantically goes beyond just the pay, but it also establishes a trust, because it's obvious that these guys were with him at a certain point because he could pay them. But at the same certain time, you also have to trust someone in order to be paid, because if you rely on that someone, you can't just say, well, I rely on him because he has money. You also have to think of him capable of providing you that money. So he would be really praised also as an individual, because he made things done. He was a successful businessman. He knew how to use his capitals, how to invest them, how to use his resources, and this is excruciatingly important at this time in history. Another thing that is interesting is the relation with the king of Aragon. Now you have to think that Aragon at this time was dramatically expanding into the Western Mediterranean. They were, I don't know whether still already at this point, but they were definitely allies with Venice against Genoa at a point, because obviously the Western Mediterranean was so a very strong Genoese presence, that the Genoese were regularly allied with the Angevins, so the Aragonese would be kind of their enemies. And Aragon has seized, there is this kingdom of Aragon in the northeast of the Iberian Peninsula that is made up of Catalonia and Aragon, practically. And Aragon is a kind of pastoral land. So it was, in fact, the Almogavares were kind of shepherds and other men skilled in they were light infantry, like you can find in the mountains fighting with javelins and stuff, the kind of like guerrilla warfare that's always been typical of the Iberian mainland. And then you had the Catalonia, that instead, with Barcelona, was developing as a sort of trades, extremely powerful trade center. During the 13th century, there is a dramatic rise of Catalonian naval power, both militarily and economically speaking, because they went in parallel. So there is this conjugation that the kingdoms of Aragon, that also had Catalonia, were able to do, that is to use their military power to go oversea and conquer other parts of the Mediterranean. So they got Sicily. At this point they were taking away Sardinia from Pisa, by the way, kicking literally the peasants out of there with consecutive victories, etc. So they were a fresh power, the Aragonese, at this time. But it still was very difficult for 13th, 14th century standards to keep all these domains all over the Mediterranean. So what is interesting with the relation between Roger and King Frederick is that King Frederick is impressed by Roger. He understands that he's a good man, that this is someone who can really carry out things. And that's the best administrator you can have. So that he entrusts him with, or maybe even enthaves him, I don't really know the details of the story, with certain castles in Sicily, from which he could expand his own business and keep him doing that. And he's being sent at the end, in fact, even to to raid into along Italy, Spain, France, etc. And he getting, by the way, a support also in material ways with ships, etc. The actual possibility of doing that, and having the allowance from a king to do that is quite important at this point. So you can understand how the political powers at that time were really built with something that could be even quite temporary or experimental, but that seemingly worked. I mean, those who could carry out all these business and military operations were indeed people to invest on. And here really also the sea is really the key of the whole story. You know, all of this could have not been practically possible on land at this time. On ship, you could really do anything. Sailing from one place to another was the fastest means of communication of that time, compared to relative costs and energies. Here it says he literally spoiled all the costs and the coasts. He went raiding with his own galleys, and he couldn't. He got so much wealth that he couldn't even transport it on ships, and that is very important. It's the picture of a Europe that is growing in many ways. Here Europe is already in crisis and recession, but it has overexpanded. So it's thanks to the crisis that such individuals can, hit and take all the wealth that had been accumulated in those regions. I'm sorry it doesn't tell much about military things, if not, this very strong relation with the soldiers, with certain knights that he gets to employ and with whom he becomes very close, as much as brothers. This is interesting also to think the bonds that could keep these companies up eventually. Also in terms of having spent so many adventures together and being having had to rely on each other for such a long time. The Templar thing is definitely also very, very interesting. Here the Templars are doing exactly the same thing. They're making money, making back and forth between Acre and Brindisi, and making business, exactly. In a few years the Templars would have been put under trial by the King of France, because they had become they had kind of lost much of their military prowess with the fall of the Outremer states, but they had a freaking huge patrimony, so they were pretty much in business. Only a few old veterans were, expert of military matters, and King Philip IV of France would basically annihilate them and seize all their properties that were really huge, and they were scattered all over the Mediterranean as well. The major concentration was in France, telling the truth. But there would be certain Templar dominions in Italy at this point, in many other places. And I find interesting even the origin of Roger. That is a bit of a transition here. His father was a falconer of Frederick II. Now it is quite fascinating because kind of epitomizes the best chivalric tradition. So this is also important in the story because it suggests that Roger kind of had the blood of that knight. That was a German faithful to the Swabians, so he was part of a world that really prized chivalry, honor, being faithful to your own lord. So doesn't tell much about his mother, but that she was very rich, at least her family was, in southern Italy, and that marriage had been agreed, if I'm not wrong, by the same king, I believe, by the same Frederick. So it's interesting that there is such a difference between two generations. The father, the perfect 13th century full feudal knight, and his son, a 14th century mercenary company commander, and maybe at that time the difference wasn't so marked, because after all, even after the death of, even during Frederick II's times, and eventually with his son Manfred in the Kingdom of Sicily, there were a lot of German knights who weren't really feudal lords, but just simple soldiers, like so-called stipendiari, so that is those who got the stipendium and were paid as mercenaries. So the transition was already there. But by the 14th century, these companies were really rising faster in a way that was unprecedented in many ways. There had been similar things like during the 12th century, but they were more of robbers and raiders and brigands than actual professionals of war. So here Roger embodies the new model, the one that follows the collapse of the feudal age and gets into a very much modern minded circuit that is made up of business, of trade, of war. It's very entrepreneurial. It reminds the indentures and the condotte of the that were about to be fully developed, and the story of the Almogaves here we stopped before he eventually went in the east, but there is all the story that tells you what these guys could do eventually in practice as soldiers, and it's a definitely interesting story. If you get the chance, please read the Chronicle of Ramon Muntaner. So for today, I think it's all. I hope you enjoyed this video. I tried this something new. It's the second video I'm doing essentially by reading and commenting. I don't know if you like that, just let me know in the comments. For now, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel to receive further news about my contents. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.